wasn't just a team of academics trying to create a new university. It was a team of folks who were deeply familiar, not just with education and learning, but also with workforce trends. What are people struggling to hire for? But also, where are gaps in the economy? We needed to create a place that wasn't just creating folks who could fill jobs, but create folks who can go build industries, lead institutions, create institutions. And so that's why we called it the African Leadership University. We saw our position initially in the market as how do we create the folks who are going to go and not just take jobs, but go and start companies, be business leaders, be political and civic leaders.
Hey, you found Ways We Learn, an investigation of how learning happens across all ages and modalities. Let's go learn something. Hi, folks, and welcome back to Ways We Learn. I'm Sean. I'm here with Joe and Brian, and we have another great guest today. Yusuf Ahmed is a former MIT Media Lab researcher, and for education geeks like me who taught kids to code, he was part of the group that invented both Scratch and LEGO Robotics. And if you're not an education geek, both of those platforms are used by millions of kids as accessible ways into computer science. He was also part of the founding team of ALU, a Pan-African network of universities and bootcamps. And Yusuf is currently the VP of New Products at the Reinvention Lab at Teach for America, an accelerator where he supports the work of innovators, new school models, and startups. And so today, we're going to get a retro on African Leadership University from Yusuf. We're going to talk about the thesis behind it and how it grew from one campus to a huge presence across Africa. So Yusuf, welcome. Thank you for joining Ways We Learn.
Excited to be here.
So Brian, you want to lead us off?
So Yusuf, with the retro, we typically like to talk to someone after they've left an organization and have had some time to think back on their work, what they've achieved. So for ALU specifically, we'd love to hear about the start of it, but also really get into the academics and how that evolved in the org over time. So just in general, for those of us who don't know, can you give us the general background of the African Leadership University? When did it start? What was the ecosystem like at the time as well?
Yeah, sure. So I'll start with a bit of context. The project grew out of this thing called the African Leadership Academy. So it was founded mainly by Fred Swaniker and a team of three other guys, a few coming out of Stanford GSB. Some had started businesses before in Africa, some had started businesses elsewhere, but they saw just this gap for entrepreneurial leaders, like folks they saw a lot of talented young folks across Africa, but they weren't seeing primarily secondary school options that were really just catalyzing these folks to lead, whether it's politically in the world of business. And so they created this thing back in the early mid 2000s, incubated at Stanford at the D School, and then launched it. And what they noticed over time is that a lot of their sharpest folks would go to college in Europe or the US and wouldn't come back. And they're like, we're contributing to the brain drain. We're taking our brightest and most talented kids from across the continent. One of them had a film made about him that's on Netflix, The Boy Who Harnessed the Wind. Yeah, low-income kid from Malawi, hacker, tinkerer, started building wind power in his village, just again with hack together stuff and with resources that he was discovering randomly, right? Keep in mind, he had little to no connectivity. Folks like him would come to ALA and then leave Africa, either go to Europe or go to the US for university and just wouldn't come back for various reasons. They'd make friends, they'd fall in love, they'd find opportunities out there. And so the initial impetus was, why are they not staying? Even the best universities in Africa, they don't compare to the best universities in Europe or the US. Like MIT, Stanford, et cetera, liberal arts colleges, most universities, like elite universities, whether it's Stellenbosch, UCT in Cape Town, for a lot of these kids, it's not quite the same. If you're choosing between MIT and UCT at University of Cape Town, you're likely going to go to MIT if you're a hacker. And so they saw that. They also saw that if you just look at a macro level of the kids who graduated, if you take every 100 kids, 8 of those kids go to college, right? Of those 8, 4 graduate college and 2 actually get a job. Just if you think about how wild those numbers are, clearly there's something structurally broken in higher ed in Africa. In the 50s, 60s, a lot of colonial powers intensely underdeveloped higher ed institutions. The British learned from their experience in India. An educated local elite isn't always a good thing. Different flavors of colonialism as well. So there's a lot of political history that shapes the underdevelopment of higher ed across the continent. But the short version to the story is just you have a paucity of options, both elite options, but also just across the range. And so looking at that problem space, the teams of Fred started assembling a team. I joined at the end of that first year. And what they did is kind of started doing research, looking around at who's innovating and breaking the model in higher ed. So they visited places like BYU, Idaho, the university that was influenced by Clay Christensen's early work, thinking about disruptions in education. Places like Minerva, which it's an innovative university based out of California. Places like High Tech High, They looked at high performing charter schools, and they also looked at bootcamps. We kind of looked at a lot of different options. We also talked to a bunch of employers, big employers, multinational companies, small employers. And I think candidly that as we get through the story, that was like one of the ingredients I think that differentiated us from a lot of other players trying to start up new higher ed institutions. It wasn't just a team of academics trying to create a new university. It was a team of folks who were deeply familiar, not just with education and learning, but also with workforce trends. What are people struggling to hire for? But also, where are gaps in the economy? We needed to create a place that wasn't just creating folks who could fill jobs, but create folks who can go build industries, lead institutions, create institutions. And so that's why we called it the African Leadership University. We kind of saw our position initially in the market as like, how do we create the folks who are going to go and not just take jobs, but go and start companies, be business leaders, be political and civic leaders. And so we launched in 2015. We started our first campus in Mauritius. It's a small island off the coast of Madagascar. The thesis was, let's start at the top of the market. If you think about like Tesla's master plan, you start with something expensive that's for the top of the market, and then you work your way down. And so we're like, okay, we'll build something that kind of resembles a university. Well, resembles a university. So it's familiar enough to a consumer where it's like, okay, it's like an experience. I'm going somewhere for 3 to 4 years. I get a degree at the end of it. But that's where I think we really departed from like most universities. We were similar to Minerva in terms of we created a detailed skills map that was cultivated by, again, talking to employers, talking to entrepreneurs, talking to political civic leaders, and getting a sense of what are the mix of skills that we want people to be great at by the end of their degree. We also looked at, again, similar to Minerva, we started with a foundation year. So before committing to a major, you go through what we call the leadership core. So it's a mixture of courses and what we call data and decisions, communicating for impact, entrepreneurial leadership, and projects. At the end of that first year, as part of the program, we're like, to progress, you have to get an internship. And the reason we wanted that is, again, we didn't just want folks living in the ivory tower. We wanted them living in the world. And with that first class, we started with 173 students from across the continent. Those 170-ish students, they came from a range of economic backgrounds. Some wouldn't be able to get on a plane if we didn't get a ticket for them. Some from very affluent backgrounds, sons and daughters of political or business elites. But what we did with that first class is everyone was funded by a corporate sponsor.
Got it. Okay, that was going to be my question, which is what's the funding model?
Yeah. So the cost of that first, like when we started, $10,000 per year.
Like, 10,000 US dollars.
$10,000 per year plus cost of living. And right. Just to put that in perspective, that's like a university in the US charging $150,000 per year.
But exactly, I was going to say, that's incredibly expensive.
Yeah, it's incredibly expensive, especially when you think about like buying power for the typical African consumer. That's why I think our thesis was startup market. And so we had some families that could easily pay that. They were already sending their kids to Europe or the US. For them, it's okay. Like this is actually in some respects a discount. And like looking back then, like there was a conversation we had was our tuition too low? If you think about like how certain consumers buy like higher ed products, it's they're like cost is often associated with quality.
Of course. So the corporate sponsors that were funding, I imagine the folks that were not super wealthy. What was the reason for that? Was it just like nonprofit public good, or was there like and then you'll get interns at the other side, or some sort of kind of workforce partnership?
It wasn't CSR. It was like a workforce partnership. The analogy I'd give you in the US is Guild. It's education as a benefit. And like the reason why companies do it is, yes, you get a tax write-off, but the real incentive for like, actually like you work with Guild is like worker retention. Folks are like getting upskilled on the job. They stay around longer. They're more effective. I think the similar challenge is we aligned incentives. We had employers who were struggling to hire. They needed to build their future leadership pipeline, and they had skin in the game. They're like, we're not getting good enough graduates from African institutions, and like folks who are educated in the US and Europe, they don't want to come back, right? For a lot of different reasons. And so they had skin in the game. And so the other thing I'll quickly say is like, after that first batch of internships, about half of the employers were blown away. Like our goal, like the goal for the first year, like success of that first year is like, how do employers react at the end of that summer internship, but also how do students react? Some tried to hire our students just after 1 year of university. And that was like the first kind of seed of an idea. What if we just spun out that first year core into like a standalone bootcamp? And we'll get to that later in 2018, we did that.
I'd like to delve into some of the design of this curriculum from this concept of, it sounds like workforce preparedness was really what you were going for. You weren't going for scholarship with this university. You were trying to build workers. You were trying to build people that were going to stay in Africa and build the economy, it sounds like. Talk about building the skills map going from that to the development of the curriculum and the day-to-day, week-to-week, month-to-month program design?
Yeah, sure. I'm going to start with an assertion you made. Like the goal here is workforce development. I disagree with that. I think the goal so like one success metric is can you crush it in a job? But the goal here is we're trying to build makers and builders. The reason why we invest in that is, again, like the idea is like, go like get a job, yes, because like companies are paying for your degree and a lot of you guys need jobs. But the goal is that's a stepping stone to something bigger, either leadership in another company or ideally creating your own thing. So again, the context here is you have economies that need folks that are going to build institutions and build organizations, whether they're for-profit, nonprofit, or public. That relates to your second question, which is around, okay, backward design. What does a skills map look like? And so we built out 7 meta skills, everything from like quantitative thinking to critical thinking to personal leadership to collaboration. Like how do you work well with others? In terms of our backward designs, we started just with the first year. And we wanted to build a foundation across these 7 skills in the first year. And we went down to, okay, which courses are particularly, where are we going to evaluate, really emphasize evaluation. For example, this projects course, it's a series of across the year, you're working on real projects for some kind of external stakeholder. And you're delivering something of real value to that client that they actually end up using. The client, for them, the skin in the game is we're getting like a bunch of smart kids to create a bunch of different things for us. And we get to pick what we end up using.
Was the skills map developed with those clients, or is it like a bunch of you sitting in a room with a whiteboard saying, here's the skills we want?
It wasn't developed with those clients. It was developed in conversation with employers and entrepreneurs. It's like looking at like, tell me about your best hires. Tell me about the folks who like really excel. Tell me about the folks you've struggled with. What do they struggle with? A lot of folks just can't manage themselves. They can't manage their time. And so as part of our like personal leadership, learning outcome, it's not just around like identity, like mission, purpose. It's also about like, just like, can you manage yourself? Can you show up? Are you reliable? Are you dependable? Yep. That shapes up the meta skill map. And the meta skill map, like the other thing is like it evolves, right? The way we treated the university, it's constantly in beta, right? Every time you run a class through, and like you guys know this, but like product cycles and education are very different than software product cycles. Your learning time is just longer. And one of the things that we would try to do is like, how do you reduce your cycle so you can learn and iterate faster?
I think one of the keys to any of these skills maps, right, is that there is some tree structure to them. Yep. But it requires to get down one layer, you have to know the layers above. How would you handle assessment generally? And then specifically, I'm curious on the meta concepts that you were talking about, those 7 meta concepts.
Yeah. So I'll take something that's easier, I think, for most folks to wrap their head around. Writing. Let's take our communicating from back class. And from outcomes for the communicating from back class, there's a lot of stuff related to like normal like communication, like your abilities to synthesize, to communicate in different ways, like in written form and verbal form. Don't remember the specific language of like the learning outcomes. So the way we had it, it's like the meta skill, we had core skills, and each core skill had very specific learning outcomes underneath each one. And then so for a given like unit in like communicating for impact class, you go through that cycle, but each unit has some kind of summative assessment. And that summative assessment is tagged to specific learning outcomes and to specific core skills. And in some cases, we might have multiple assessments just so we can cover the skills that we needed to cover. Grading was definitely hard. Like candidly, and it's still hard. I don't think it's a solved problem.
What made it hard?
I think one is just like time, dude. Like giving good quality feedback, even just on writing. We didn't assign like 5-paragraph essays. An example would be write an op-ed, write an executive summary related to like a project you're working on in another course. Make a pitch for something that you want to create or build. Actually giving good qualitative feedback takes time. You have to read whatever the student wrote, like actually give them good feedback. And especially like when you're trying to do something in a mastery-based way and go through multiple cycles, that's not just one round of feedback. For some of these kids, it's 3-4 rounds of feedback. And then you add on the fact that not everyone's an English language native speaker, right? I think the second thing that we struggled with is just pure learning. Not everyone is committed. Not everyone's interested. Not everyone has the skills to get feedback. And then there's all the kind of relational stuff that blows that kind of stuff up. We had moments where kids are like, we don't want peer groups at all. Can you go back to lecturing? So we sat down, we had an intervention after the class. I remember, and we talked about why we don't have a lecture-based approach and what it takes to prepare for an active calculus class. Like the calculus classes I went to at Columbia, the ones I'd see like undergrads at MIT take were all lecture-based. And you might go to a discussion section or office hours, but like discussion section, office hours are like review the problem set, right? There's actually no real like designed and structured collaboration. There's no designer actually reflecting on like, hey, did we actually design for like students to actually go through like reps at this? Like, are they getting deeper? Are they making connections? Whereas that was a point of an in-person class for calculus, and that required students doing some work beforehand. It only works if you show up and are doing the work outside of core class.
When you're saying show up, were you talking about assignment turn-in rates? Were you talking about attendance rates? Like, how would you measure that?
Yeah, so it's like doing the work before coming to class.
Got it. Because it's all flipped.
Yeah, you got to, yeah, exactly.
And how many people actually did all the work? Because every time I've implemented flipped, we just kept getting hammered on the fact that no one actually did the work ahead of time.
For the founding class, dude, the rates are actually really high. Like you're talking like typically 80+%. It was actually pretty wild,
Really?
but that didn't scale.
Right.
I think
okay,
that's so that as the university has scaled, that's a part that's actually that's like the team still is still trying to figure out.
How did you articulate that to students? What flipped faster? Because it's so weird for a lot of students. How did you articulate why you're able to get such a high rate in the early days?
So part of it's actually selection. Like the way we selected students, like one of the factors we looked at, you can call it grit, you can call it resilience. We were looking for people who are like in just plain speak, like hustlers.
Right.
Like who had a lot of like drive and it shows up in a lot of different ways. There's like onboarding.
Yeah.
Like we're big on onboarding both faculty and students. One of the big things we're like, hey, to succeed here, it's about ownership. And I think there's a lot of lip service to like values, but we had a culture of giving feedback based on values. If a student wasn't showing up, leading outside of class, we weren't just talking to their faculty. I would step in. I ran office hours in the dorms every week after dinner. And I'd be there like sometimes twice a week for like, hour, like 2 evenings. And I'd prioritize folks who weren't showing up.
I've been thinking about what you brought up with FAR transfer because we actually recorded an episode on that. And I'm curious, before we get to scale, how did you try to intentionally build for and support and assess FAR transfer? Because that's one of the sort of
it's really
golden
hard
tickets in education, right? And it's very difficult to do. And I'm really curious how you conceived of the support for that and how you actually measured it.
It was easier in the first year because of how collaboratively designed the first year was. If we had a master rubric, that faculty saw all the skills in the rubric. They could see like, what not just what they were focused on assessing, but they could also assess on other things. I.e., I'm teaching a project section of like, 30 students who are working on a project for X client. And I see a student like using quantitative skills that they picked up in like their data and decisions course. They're taking the initiative to use a skill in a context where they're not prompted to do it. I think that that's why FAR transfer, I think, to me matters so much. Because if you think about the challenges of like traditional academic learning, it's much easier to answer questions when you're prompted and you're trained and like schooled that like, okay, if I get this kind of question, this is how I answer. But if you go into a novel situation, it's really hard for any human being to be like, actually, what tools do I have that might help me like work through this? And so that was like a big thing that we emphasized within that kind of leadership core founding team. It still is something that I think the university part of the business needs to figure out. But it's definitely not easy.
You sent us the ALU Science of Learning document. Is that something that we can share as part of the podcast notes?
Yeah, you can share it. It's old and dated. That's from 2018, but feel free to post it.
But that's fine. I mean, it gives some insight into how you were thinking about the educational philosophy, which I love.
And it includes at the end an example of a unit.
So one of the things I want to dig into a little bit more that you brought up is your teachers, were they majority industry experts? Was that like a main criteria of it?
If I think about some of the best faculty members, two of the ones that come to mind, one had a PhD. Keno, who now leads academics at Kibo, was one of our best faculty members. Incredible. Cambridge PhD in mechanical engineering, worked at IBM Research in Nairobi. And we were lucky that she joined our team as an engineering faculty member. So she was teaching calculus, she would teach other engineering courses. What made her incredible is like this obsession around how do I keep getting better for my students.
Did she have teaching experience before working with you all or no?
Yeah, but not a lot.
Okay.
Not a lot. Again, she's come from IBM Research, right? So she taught at grad school. The other ones I think about are folks who were younger, like mid to late 20s, had work experience, had management experience, loved coaching, again, obsessed with students, really open to iterating. The point is like the first time you do anything, you're not going to do a great job, but you need to like keep iterating and improving.
I'm curious how you conceived of the hiring process and conceived of the teachers that you wanted to bring in. Were you looking for people who were domain experts specifically as sort of a higher criteria than educationalists? Or were you looking for people who were both? Or were you you said that some of the best faculty members, you just said this, are not people who had taught really, but was that your hypothesis that those are going to be the best people to bring in, or was that just sort of what happened?
So in terms of hiring, what we did is I was involved in the early days. The profile of person that I was hiring is different than the profile of folks that are being hired today. I was looking for unicorns. We asked them to design like Like literally kind of give me a sense of what are the skills in this program? Give me a sense of some arc. What might an experience look like? And then like design a concrete lesson. That's a really heavy assignment. It would typically take about like 20 hours to complete. And then at the end of it, we'd have people actually like facilitate a 30-minute to hour-long like lesson. I think through that, we are a set of unicorns, like people who are incredible. Again, across the board, not everyone had teaching experience, but they had domain expertise because I believe you need domain expertise, like if you're teaching electrical engineering or computer science.
One of the things that you mentioned is you were sort of trying to decrease the learning cycles about the curriculum, about the program itself. So how did you gather feedback from the students? And actually, how did you try to push down that timeline? Because that's something that a lot of educational institutions are trying to do, and everybody takes a different approach. I know people who would want to survey every minute if they could. So I'm kind of curious how you approached it.
People get survey fatigue. We did versions of that where we had surveys at the end of every week. We'd have them do it in class as part of the end of a unit. But for the entire first year, that's what we did. At the end of every single learning cycle, there was a survey in class that students completed. We as a team would review both survey data, actual learning data, and everything from what's completed, what's not completed, how are people performing. We'd compare cross sections to see, okay, is one faculty member doing something different than like another? And we'd compare across courses to get a sense of, okay, what are we particularly effective in, as well as learning outcomes or like core skill areas. Redesign takes time. It takes capacity, it requires bandwidth. And we had more of that in the beginning. We accounted for that. And I think part of, again, if you want to increase your rate of learning, it also, I think, requires increasing capacity to both make meaning of what you're learning and then find ways to integrate and change things. Because if you want to change things from one learning cycle to another, you need time to redesign. You need time to redesign in a way that also accounts for follow-on effects. You're not just redesigning for the following unit. The things are cumulative. And if you're trying to integrate that, you need to think about, okay, what are like ripple effects across the system? One of the things we learned that year is you can't iterate everything. And so it'd just be like, what is most broken? And what do we feel has the greatest impact or leverage on like student learning, student experience?
Gotcha. One thing I'm curious about is what sort of technology did you either buy or build to run the school? Did you guys buy an LMS? Did you build one? What was that like?
I'm laughing because, like, as you guys probably know, Brian's history with LMSs, we tried building one.
They're fun.
We spent a lot of money and time, and it was called Funda. The students had a meme, "Fix my Funda." Oh man, or FML became related to like Funda. Like, it was Funda my life.
We should have a new podcast. All it is just people talking about the time they try to build their own LMS.
So we switched after a year or two. We did that for that first year. Failed pretty epically for a lot of different reasons, and built on top of OpenEdX. We took an instance of OpenEdX and just built on top of that.
Were any of the founders of ALU technical, out of curiosity?
No, there are no technical founders. One of the debates we had is, are we building a university or a tech company?
Yeah, that's it. No, say that again, because that's a huge point.
Are you building a university or a tech company? And we quickly realized you need to focus on one or the other. Like because your resources get quickly diluted, attention gets diluted. Yep. There's a desire to build an LMS that's tailored to the kind of learning that you're trying to do. And there's merit there. A lot of LMSs are built around traditional ideas about learning.
I've seen that the places where building your own LMS tends to work is when a founder, and actually most typically the CEO, is highly technical. Those are the places that I've seen it work. Outside of that, it tends to become a FML type of situation, I guess.
Make schools my favorite examples where like deeply technical founders, but they didn't try building their own software. They focused purely on the program and the curriculum. Yes, you need a technical founder to do it. And it's a question of focus. I don't think you can do both.
It's hard. You need a lot of cash.
Yeah, you need to be really big and a lot of cash. And
dude, it's not just cash. It's like focus. Also a question of focus.
It's also another problem that I find is it's a question of timeline mismatch. The timeline of an engineering team actually is much slower than the timeline of a service business. And so when you're operating a business that operates on two completely different timescales, it's really hard.
Let's actually jump into the business part. So my understanding of ALU, and one of the things that was most fascinating to me, is that it had to be like 2 orders of magnitude cheaper than like the average university. So how did you build a university that was affordable and scalable?
The short story here is our first campus in Mauritius is like our Tesla Roadster. Expensive. You're going to freaking like Mauritius, which is like an island paradise. And it subsidized curriculum development. It subsidized some of the software work that we did. It's like this great place you can take CEOs or investor types, and where they see the magic of the learning as well. It's like the showpiece. Our second campus in Rwanda, dramatically cheaper, $3,000 per student per year. The Rwandan government wanted us to be one of their flagship campuses. The other one is Carnegie Mellon University's campus there. So they gave us land. They put us as part of this new development. And so we're like, okay, this will be like the kind of Roadster Light Model S. Again, like elite, a demonstration site for what powerful learning looks like with more resources. We were the largest provider of income sharing agreements across Africa. And so like we were pretty early to the ISA game. If you're not familiar with an income sharing agreement, basically you can think of it as akin to a loan, but instead of paying back interest, you pay back a percentage of your salary. The thesis behind that is it gives us skin in the game to make sure people are successful afterwards. The risks that still have not been borne out, right, is like we need to figure out the regulations behind that. We have kids from across the continent, 40 different countries. How do you facilitate payments? How do you ensure folks are paying once they get a job? So far, folks are paying, right? But again, we have a very small sample size of graduates. And then the last thing I'll say in terms of like reducing cost is that's where we went to the bootcamp model. Both Mauritius and Rwanda are still akin to land grant universities. They're campuses, right? And one of the theses we had long-term is that investing in a big campus is not a good idea financially. Like it's not worth it taking on that kind of resource cost. And so in Nairobi, Joburg, like other places where we've been opening these ALX learning hubs, we're embedded in either co-working spaces or there's a corporate partner involved. But the idea is like getting rid of like dramatically reducing your CapEx by reducing your space cost and also reducing program life, like running just more cohorts of shorter 3 to 6 month programs that get people out into the workforce faster. And that's also just like it relates to market needs in that context.
What were the class sizes out of curiosity? How big was the average class at the beginning and then how's that changed?
Yeah. So we started off with like 20, 30 students in the beginning. You can run a great active learning class with 20 or 30 if it's well designed and like facilitator is prepared to do that. And if the students, again, like there's been onboarding and support to like engage in a different kind of way. With the degree programs, like the numbers just fell just because like we were like building from the ground up different learning pathways. After your first year, you declare a mission, like you're interested in data science and healthcare. And so you kind of work on projects related to that. You can take like kind of, you piece together courses related to what you're interested in, but you also can do internships during the year.
I've never seen a successful implementation of putting student ownership over the learning. Mm-hmm. It almost seems like if you're going to a school, you're going there because you want somebody to tell you what to do and to kind of sit on
that's
you.
Exactly.
Or at least
that's exactly what you're doing when you go to school. That's why it's so hard when people transition from school to the real world. Because no more hoops to jump through. And it's especially bad if you are trying to attract the highest grade average students, because the reason they got the highest grade average is they're probably very smart, but also they're insanely good at finding the hoops and jumping through them.
We try to address some of that with selection. We would turn down some folks who had perfect grades, but had no evidence of initiative outside of school.
Yeah, let's actually jump into that real quick. What was the admissions process like? It seems like this initial class was a pretty wide range of people. Did that change over time? Did you learn that there was like a specific cohort or a specific personality of student that you were looking for?
So all universities do this. You check your admissions against like how people perform both during the program and after. We did make tweaks. One of the things we realized actually is like we had this optional course. It was mandatory in the first cohort and then it was optional after. And we realized completing this online course was an indicator of success, which is like, it felt arbitrary, but it was, to your point, Joe, like actually taking initiative. You needed to find peers in other parts of the continent. You needed to come up with a project idea and go pursue it, not just indexing on grades. I think that was the other thing. There are kids who had like 4.0 GPAs who didn't always pan out. And so I think it's just kind of making sure like we had some kind of way of accounting for agency.
What was the motivation of the incoming students like? One of the things I'm always thinking about when I'm designing a program is, are the students motivated or are they not? Because that's a drastic change typically in the design.
We're still a drop in the bucket. And so like the university is still very selective. And so you're still getting folks who are like our top in terms of motivation, initiative, drive, not always academics. Because we had some folks who had mediocre academics, but we take a chance on them. And part of the reason was, again, the kind of initiative, drive, leadership capabilities outside of school. The other thing is I keep thinking about, I don't know if you guys know this book, Academically Adrift by Aram and Roxa. It's like these sociologists wrote this book, I think about 10 years ago. One of the things that they track is like the CLS plus data. So it's a critical thinking test. And they track how that data declines during college in the United States, including at liberal arts colleges and especially among humanities majors.
Wait, did you say it
degrees where,
declines during college?
Yes, it decline. Critical thinking skills decline during college.
I hate and love that stat.
I know, but it's real because you have a lot of like faculty members who are like defending the humanities and liberal arts for promoting critical thinking and civics. And the reality is it's a bunch of right? Universities in the US don't really do that.
Yeah.
And if you look at what universities in the US are converging on, the kind of model is like, how do we become a tier 1 research university? How do we get more research funds? And like that's dripping all the way down to the community college level. On the student side of the experience, it's often, here's 3 to 4 years of like kind of drift. The academically drift metaphor is powerful for me because you're not just academically drifting, you're just kind of like drifting in your life. I'll take this class, maybe it'll lead to this thing. If you really probe and ask kids, why are you doing what you're doing? It's often very, very superficial. I think for all the things around innovation, I think the one thing I'll just say is relationships matter at the end of the day. And I think if you design any kind of a learning program environment, locally or at scale, it's a network design problem. How do you design, as a friend likes to put it, a place where everyone can find their circle of badass peers? Peers and mentors and elders. That's not my line. That's from Seth Trudeau.
Well, credit to you.
Yeah.
Yusuf, thank you for taking the time for this. This was so interesting to hear about and to learn about. And I think people are going to be fascinated to learn about not just the business model, but also the way that you were thinking about education. And it sounds like an incredible experiment. And thank you for sharing that with us.
Really nice meeting you two. Brian's spoken really highly about y'all.
Oh, it's all nice.
Let's get you back on here. It is. Let's get you back on here for some Teach for America stuff, or maybe some MIT, or just in general rambles.
Yeah, definitely down to come back.
It's great to meet you, Yusuf.
All right. Thanks, folks. And always keep learning. Did you learn something just now? Get the full episode of Ways We Learn wherever you get your podcasts. And while you're there, we'd love to get your rating or review.